welcome to Peccadillo Pictures Sofa Club. Tonight we're going to be discussing Little Richard, I Am Everything, and it's one of actually my favorite documentaries of the year. When I first saw it, I was blown away. It's directed by Lisa Cortez, and because I look at credits to the end, it's also executive produced. One of the executive producers is Dee Reese, who made the wonderful Pariah, which was screened in Flair. The Little Richard documentary was also debuted in Sundance. Today we have amazing guests to discuss the film. We have Marc Thompson, David Maurice Braithwaite, and Jsky. Marc Thompson is a co-founder of Prepster and also a wonderful Instagram account called Black and Gay Back in the Day. Jsky presents 2 radio shows, one on the BBC and one on Gadio. And David Maurice Braithwaite is a producer. Before we continue, we're going to play a trailer from the film.
It's just like a shot out of a cannon.
His voice?
He created the rock and roll icon.
Sorry, y'all. It wasn't Elvis.
I am the king of rock and roll!
The first songs that you love that your parents hate is the beginning of the soundtrack of your life.
Little Richard's lyrics were too lewd to get airplay on the radio.
It was just as clean as you were.
He was very good at liberating other people. He was not good at liberating himself.
Michael was inspired by me. Prince, James Brown, I discovered him. Jimi Hendrix was my guitar player.
I used to stand on the desk and do Little Richard.
Everyone was beholden to him.
Welcome back. Jsky, Marc, or David, do you have any quick things that you want to say before we look at the context of Little Richard's childhood?
Just thank you for having me on this panel. Little Richard is an icon, and it's such a powerful documentary as well. It is an amazing documentary. David?
I said an amazing documentary, a kind of interesting re-examination.
And Marc?
Yeah, thanks for having me as well. Like the guys have said, I mean, it's a brilliant documentary. And I think for me, it's also a great opportunity to start reclaiming Little Richard.
Exactly, because he was out in the cold for such a long time. And, it's good to see that his legacy has come forward. Well, we're going to see a clip which contextualizes his childhood. And then we're going to come back and have a chat about that. So let's play that clip, please.
I would get there and I would sing, but they wouldn't let me sing that much because I wouldn't stop. And then people started hearing little turns and things in my voice and started requesting me. People used to come to me when I was a little boy for me to pray for them. And my mother used to say that you're crazy.
I will say this 100,000 times. The South is the home of all things queer, of the different, of the non-normative, of the other side, of the gothic, of the grotesque. Note that queerness is not just about sexuality, but about a presence in a space that is different from what we require or expect, different from the norm.
And back in that day, you have Sunday clothes. And so I would take my mother's Sunday pins, her little brooches and things, and put them on my Monday jacket and my Tuesday shirt. I wore my mother's curtains, the sheets, put on some makeup on my face. My dad liked to kill me.
They called him a sissy, a punk, a faggot.
When he came to town, whites were exposed to him. It was kind of a shock.
My dad didn't like my actions and my ways. I was born deformed from a child.
One of my legs was long, one of them was small.
Really?
And this is my long arm, and this is my short arm. It was just, I never could do nothing good. He told me to get out of the house, that he didn't want me there no more, that he hated me. And he says that I wanted 7 boys and you're messing it up. Because I was gay, he put me out.
I think that was one of the most complex clips, really, because for me, it encapsulates the kind of multi-layered experience of being Black and queer in that time and the church. Because as we probably all know, gospel is no stranger to Black queerness, and many what they call sissy men are quite involved in gospel music and in the church. So it's the sort of don't ask, don't tell. But on the other hand, there's a lot of violence that the Christian church does to gay men, which Little Richard experienced himself. And I don't know if you, any of you have any thoughts on that. I'm going to come to you, Mark, around that whole thing of the church, queerness, Blackness.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing I need to kind of say straight up is that I don't have that lived experience, right?
Yes.
And the notion.
Neither do I. I'll say too.
And also, really quickly, the notion of being rejected by family or facing violence, and so that idea that this happens to all Black queer people, that's not always true. But I think that what was really telling for me when I watched that clip was I thought about James Baldwin, actually, and James Baldwin being a preacher and being really successful in the church, and how that shaped him. So I think that as much as there is that negativity, and you're absolutely right about the violence that's meted out on us, is that so much of that does shape who we are. And very often it gives us voice as well. And it comes out in the art, in the creativity. So even if you look at, say, Billy Porter, who's featured in there, came up through the church, and that lives through his performance as well. So I tried to look to what were the good things that people like Little Richard, James Baldwin, Billy Porter, etc., took from the church.
Yes, thank you. Jsky, any thoughts?
Similar to what Mark said, I think I've been quite lucky in terms of getting my family's support. Obviously, it wasn't an easy thing for them to come to terms with straight away. I think all parents have an idea of who and what their children should be, and especially when you're from a minority, they're a lot more protective, and rightly so, because the world's not always kind to us. But when I was younger, I used to go to church with my nana, and she sang in the choir, and I've always had a love for gospel music myself. But as I came into my own, I felt like there might have been a little bit of a shame associated with it, and I haven't really felt like I've been able to go back fully. So it's something I do miss. I do miss going to church with my nana. But in terms of like Little Richard's story, I think it's important that we do get to see this other side of him, the vulnerable side, because I think especially with male figures or with Black male figures, and we're made out to be scary, to be ultra tough, and it just shows that we're actually human. And I think with rock stars in particular, like we're made to be otherworldly, and we are in many ways, but like at the same time we still have feelings. And that clip when it said about how he felt, well, we got to see how he felt from the rejection from his father. I think instinctively we all crave our father's approval, and just to impress our parents, that no matter what our relationship is with our parents, deep down we all have their DNA, and so part of us craves to be accepted on a deeper level. And it resonated with me a lot.
Yeah, and David, what were your thoughts around that? Because I'll come back to that.
I think it comes from that sort of classical gospel tradition that musicians of that period came from. James Brown, Fats Domino, all the kind of people. Sorry?
Aretha Franklin.
All came from gospel. And that change from gospel to rock and roll, which obviously he was, as he would say, the originator of it, was a whole period. You know, if you look at, as we get on later on to the, I mean, having been thrown out, he went and worked on the chilling circuit. You know, with, as well, yeah. If you watch the film, you'll discover a little bit more. He comes from that tradition of Black musicians who become something.
Yes, I think so. I think that the complexity is in his relationship to his parents. It was his father who was violent, and his father was a preacher. His mother was very accepting of him. And back to your point, Mark, about, we all don't come from families that are violently, against us. However, the father seemed to have been violent anyway to everyone. And, Little Richard, as it says in the clip, was also disabled and what they called a sissy boy. There's an album made of a compilation of tunes from the 1920s and 30s called Sissy Man Blues. I recommend people listen to that because it's music of the time that was explicitly queer, black and queer. Yeah. So, when people think our history is one of not acceptance within blackness, we'll talk about that in a bit. The segregation of black culture was one that was quite accepting of queerness in many ways. And the Chitlin circuit that you speak about, David, had people like Estarita in it, who inspired Little Richard's look, and Sister Rosetta Tharpe, who's meant to be the originator of rock and roll as well, who came from that church and gospel tradition. It wasn't either or. And doing the research,
Actually, I really do think it was either or. You either stayed in the church or you went on the Chitlin circuit. That was the reality. And without the Chitlin circuit, there wouldn't be rock and roll, and we wouldn't have.
Yes, I think rock and roll, but I'm saying that there were queer people in the church. And if you've ever seen the movie Amazing Grace, which is with Aretha Franklin, James Cleveland, who is the church leader, is gay.
It's a great documentary.
It's a fantastic film. And when I saw him conducting, I read him as queer, and then doing the research found that he was queer, but silently so. And, we'll talk about the idea of out and in and closets. And how that is read in Black culture. You wanted to say something, David? Please do.
No. I was just listening.
Oh, okay. Does anybody want to add anything to that? Because, Mark, you always say this idea of us being rejected by Blackness is a very dominant force, and even here, we don't have that experience. So why is it?
Well, I'm not going to. I mean, that's kind of a question I don't really have the answer to, right? I think that, there's a level of anti-blackness, which is part of that. There's a level of we're not smart enough, or we're not cosmopolitan enough, and all of these different things, which why that label stuck onto us. But I think what I'm really interested in here is when you say that there are many queer people in the church. But one of the reasons Little Richard faced so much rejection was because he was femme presenting, because he wore his mother's clothes. And so if you compare him to, say, James Cleveland, much later on, and so many other people who are gospel directors and choir leaders and all the rest of it, it's about what you rock up as and how you present. And I'm sure if Little Richard had gone about his business quietly in the church, he would have had a very, very different experience of it. So it's about how we recognize and look at people who present as femme, how we look at gender expression more than the sexuality of an individual.
Absolutely. And it's back, as we say to that, silently in, don't ask, don't tell. I've been asked to play a trailer at the moment, so we're going to a trailer, and then we're coming back. Oh no, we're going to a clip about segregation. I do apologize. We're going to a clip about segregation.
Remember, in the 1950s, there's legal segregation. Black kids are not able to listen to music in the same spaces as white kids.
Black and white musicians weren't allowed to play together.
They had one night for white and the next night for African American.
But the white kids would come to the black kids concert too, as spectators.
The white people started leaping over the balcony and they got down with the blacks. My music broke down the walls of segregation.
there's something about this music that made black and white kids want to be together.
So have we got thoughts on this? Do we think that his music did break down the walls of segregation?
I think music's always going to have that power. Like, if you like something and you feel it, I mean, it just, how can you not? How can you not want to get up and enjoy yourself? And I think at the time, with the level of struggle that existed amongst black and white people, I think it was freeing for them. They were rebelling in many ways, just like teenagers do today. But you can't tell a child what to do sometimes, can you? When it comes to things they enjoy.
Yeah, I think that era was also the era of the creation of the teenager.
Yes.
And so it was a separation between the older adults and the teenagers, because it wasn't the same before. And so that led to that. We're teenies, we understand the language of the hip, youth, and you're old people, you don't know what's going on. And obviously there was social upheaval at the beginning of the civil rights movement too. Mark, your thoughts on music breaking down barriers? Do you think it does? Did you think it did?
I mean, I think it has. I think it certainly has the power to change individuals' minds and start seeing other people as human. Art has the power to do that, and popular music, which we underestimate very, very often, really does. I often say to people, I joke, but I mean it in some quite seriously, that the Supremes did as much for the civil rights movement as Martin Luther King, because they humanized, presented a particular image to white folk of what black people could be and could do. I mean, that's my view, my opinion on it. And I think that what Little Richard does in the 50s is certainly to start chipping away. I wouldn't say breaking down barriers, but certainly starts to chip away at it. But as we see later on in the film, when his music gets co-opted and, watered down, then you think actually the rug is pulled a little bit back.
And David, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm saying that he broke down barriers is maybe a little generous. I think in that period there were people like Ray Charles and others who actually didn't perform for a segregated audience. But that kind of period in Georgia was a period, I mean, I think for a lot of the audience that wouldn't understand that they were towns at which at 7 o'clock the black people had to leave. You couldn't, as it says in the documentary, you couldn't get petrol from a petrol station. If you did, you'd get shot. They were lynchings. There were all of those things that were happening. In terms of his performance, I think his performance and the performance of music does have the ability to change things. I think actually what Mark said is right. Actually, Martin Luther King said that Motown did as much for the civil rights movement in the 60s, and in the 60s than any other event. But yeah, I think that pulpit is really kind of a bit of a surprise.
He says in the film, because I was flamboyant, it made it easy for the white people. And I want us to kind of discuss that a little bit. Because, Mark, you spoke about the feminist being the visible queerness. But his feminist also, he said, made him not as threatening to white people. He was pretty. I don't know if you all have any thoughts on that. He wasn't the manly black man who they didn't want their daughters fancying. Thoughts?
But I've been called flamboyant a lot in my life, and it wasn't something I ever realised I was doing until I was told about it. But I completely get the whole idea of when you present a certain way, people perceive you differently. People will treat you differently, and it definitely resonated a lot with my own story, because I do like to dress up and put on a show, but at the same time, people don't always know what exactly they're looking at. That makes any sense. And I guess if you confuse people, sometimes you can also help to educate them at the same time.
And so how do you think your appearance sort of, do you feel that it makes you less threatening, or do you think? Do you want
Absolutely.
To that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I see firsthand like how I'm treated differently by people in positions of authority. Like the police, for example, they'll treat me differently if I'm about to go on stage dressed up as opposed to if I'm just coming back from the gym. I mean, there's still a lot of prejudice out there. I'm not blind to it, but at the same time, I'm optimistic because if people can treat me differently depending on how I look, I'm still the same person underneath.
Yeah.
And I think that's just continuing that whole legacy that Little Richard has left in terms of just winning people round by entertaining them.
Yeah. Does anybody have any things that they want to add to that? Because I could talk about this.
I know David. In that period, if you think of Ray Charles, if you think of James Brown and the Flames, they were charismatic. They did have costumes. They did perform on stage in a way that white audiences wouldn't get at a barn dance. That was the nature of the performance. That was the nature of the performance that they learned doing gospel. They took what was gospel and turned it into rock and roll, and the performance part of gospel was an important part of Little Richard's identity. And I think that's what you see. You see that through doing the Chitlin circuit, and then moving to a degree, as we'll find out a little bit to the mainstream.
Yeah, but in the Chitlin circuit, he was also performing in drag. He wasn't just Little Richard, and he was accepted.
But the things he learned from that circuit transferred him, became part of his background for where he went next, in the same way that did for Ray Charles and or James Brown and or Fats Domino.
Yeah, I wouldn't say they were in the same bracket though, because Little Richard did come over very queer-coded, I would say, in the way that they might have been flamboyant, but they weren't queer-coded, and they weren't camping it up in the same way that Little Richard was. I don't know if you think the same, Mark.
Well, I think what the point I want to pick up on, Campbell, is around your question around Little Richard saying by being flamboyant, by being pretty, his words, made him less threatening to white audiences. Now, I think that probably is very true for him, because there is a certain level of when we demasculate the black male, because there is a stereotype of the big black male and who we are. My worry, and you can see a line from Little Richard right through popular culture, where you have the sassy black gay friend. Now, that's the tricky line we have to balance.
Yes.
On one hand, like Jay Scott, a young queer person today, living his best life, being authentic, dressing how you want, it's an amazing thing. But on the other side, I still switch on my TV and see films of people like Billy Porter playing the sassy black snappy friend. So I think it's just that balance that one has to be aware of as time goes on. But I can see why it worked for Little Richard back at that time.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think. Sorry, Jay Sky.
No, I was just literally going to agree with what Mark had said, because there have been times where people have expected me to be that type of a person based on what they see, but once they get to hear and to actually know me, then they're like, actually, you're not what I thought you'd be at all. And people make a judgment based on what they've fed.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's really heating up now, our talk. We're going to be back after a short commercial break, for Peccadillo back catalogue film Mansfield. So see you back after this commercial break.
There's Jane Mansfield. She had a very short career, and she got killed in a very bad way.
A flaming, grinding car crash ended the bright movie career of famed Jane Mansfield on June 29, 1967. Jane Mansfield was a starry-eyed romantic. She had a passion for love and a passion for heart-shaped objects.
So what's the mystery? I'm just a perfectly normal American girl.
I remember she used to be on the Jack Benny show playing the violin. She needed to be noticed. That was like a junkie needs drugs. She had to have publicity.
When the Beatles came into town, they asked the guys, what do you want to do in America?
What movie actors would you like to meet in Hollywood? Jane Mansfield.
Jane's big downfall was her addiction to attention.
whole life became chaos and drug use and child neglect. She's always liked that dark side of things.
Well, the Anton thing, the devil thing, I never really believed she was that much of a Satanist. She just did that for the photo op.
Anton liked publicity too, so they were a perfect pair. Women, I'm sure they had an affair, which it would be unnatural if they didn't.
You're going to be a sinner, be the best sinner on the block. You're going to do something that's naughty, do it.
I always remember my father saying how intelligent a woman she was. She had one of the highest IQs of any woman he ever met.
She spoke 5 languages. I didn't know that.
Do you speak Dutch now?
A little bit.
A little bit? A little bit German too?
That is goed.
Oh, wonderful.
Hourglass and the hair and the lips.
Oh, so kissable lips.
Welcome back. We were saying a bit of German there, like Jane Mansfield. Also, John Waters and the Beatles are also in the Little Richard documentary. We were having a great conversation then, and we're going to go into this clip, which is from the Grammys, and it sort of carries on from that whole idea of how a black queer man is seen in the music industry, but also a black man who is the originator of rock and roll. I love this clip, and I often watch it and share it on Instagram. So shall we see the clip, please?
That first induction class in 1986 of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame had this double-edged sword to where it is recognition, but in a weird way, it can also be dismissal as a relic of the past. Yes, you created it, you invented it, you set the template for it, but, the people who really made it what it is are these younger bands or these white artists.
But I used to wear my hair like that. They take everything I get, they take it from me.
Because of his flamboyance, people made the mistake of not taking him seriously always as a musician, as a human, as a performer.
And the best new artist is me. I have never received nothing. You ain't never gave me no Grammy.
Is endearing, it's funny, but as a black man, watching that, I heard seething anger that underwrites what he's saying.
Shut up.
I always find this clip incredibly powerful and moving. I don't know, Jsky, what you think in terms of your response to that erasure, that whitewashing.
I think as an artist, not getting credit for something that you've done is one of the most painful things ever. And to watch someone else receive credit for a fraction of what you bring to the table, it's so degrading. And it's something that still happens today. So yeah, I mean, without saying too much, I think it's something that I feel very deeply about.
Say a bit more. You don't have to hold back if there's anything else that you want to add.
You're going to get me into trouble, you. I think that I'm a child that was brought up with the whole mantra of we have to work twice as hard to get twice as much. And I think even to this day, I find myself working incredibly hard to get very little back. But I'm very fortunate and I'm in a position where I'm very privileged and I get a lot of opportunities, which I'm very grateful for. That said, I would like more. Just like Little Richard, I'm at a place where I expect a bit more back.
Thank you. I love that. And David, thoughts on this erasure?
I think the erasure of his career and what he brought to the culture is sad and tragic of other musicians. in this particular case, I think it was. I mean, I think I agree. I actually agree with you. That clip does have a kind of bittersweet tone to it. There are other interviews. There's an interview a little bit later where Mick Jagger is sitting there going, "So what's he going to say about me?"
Yeah.
Because you know there are those kind of moments where you know that there are bits in the documentary where he does Long Tall Sally, and then you see the Beatles version. That Beatles audience at the time would not have heard of Little Richard and or anything like that. And that's a kind of interesting line where they're performing a cover version as a tribute to him, as they were his friends. But you know, there comes a moment where you needed a little more explanation.
Yes, I thought there was something else with Mick Jagger's Worry. If I had a different reading of it, but Mark, what were you thinking of that moment in the Grammys?
I mean, I've seen that clip outside of that documentary.
Yeah.
It is deeply uncomfortable, deeply moving, but also incredibly powerful because he's so unapologetic. And I just went, Jsky, you deserve more and you'll get more. But quick, back to this. But you know what really resonated for me in it? There was a clip later on with Mick Jagger where Mick Jagger says the Rolling Stones were just a tribute band. And when I watched it and I went, but you still are. You still are a tribute. You're a covers band. And that's the thing, right? Is that we're not given our due when it comes to music. We're not. And we see it right up to today, you know, with black artists and black music, and the way that, say, 90s R&B became the pop music of the noughties, but that's not credited and not understood, and they will always steal from us. But I think what that empowers us to do, which we always do as black folk, is to go and create new. Every time we steal our stuff, we just go and create new. But as I said at the outset of this, is that I really am glad that this documentary is coming out now because it gives us an opportunity to re-examine. And I actually went back and listened to those old Little Richard records, which I never had. And they're amazing pieces of music. And this is what we also need to do, is go back to the source, and you'll hear it in everything you've listened to since then.
I want to, you know, I hear everything everybody says, and I want to sort of add to this that a lot of the whitewashing and mainstreaming removes what we call the seasonings. So you have that Pat Boone version, you have the Rolling Stones version. It's never like what you call the source, Mark, but I would say it's also not the source, S-A-U-C-E. You know what I mean? It's like, there is something in which it's taken away, but it's rinsed. The blackness is toned down, the queerness is toned down, and historically, also a lot of black artists who were out in queer within black segregation, when they moved to mainstream, they got de-queered as well. So the music gets removed from any essence. You know, you can think of Richard Pryor, you can think of Gladys Bentley, you can think of all these people who were out, and then as soon as they went mainstream, there's like conversion, there's like kind of, let's not mention that in the mainstream. And then, you know, the music then gets taken over by white artists who earn more money than the original artist. You know, back to, you know, the Grammy clip in a way, but not being acknowledged, but not getting paid.
But also that he never got paid at all.
Yeah.
You the document later on the documentary. What's also, which again is the story of black musicians of that period. You know, all of them, from like James Brown to Ray Charles, people like that were all had their money stolen by record labels. It was a thing. I mean, a real thing. The thing that's interesting for me to talk about the erasure and the censorship. Little Richard censored himself to get into the mainstream. He toned down the look, the things that he was wearing. He toned down the lyrics to Tutti Frutti. You know, if you look at the original lyrics, they're really funny. This was a deeply sexual song, and these days you could get, you know, you could play it for a 4-year-old and they wouldn't get it. You know, that's the thing about him. That's the thing that, you know, he seemed aware enough that to get to a mainstream, to get paid at the end of the day, because I think that's essentially what he did, was that he had to turn it down. He had to censor himself. And along with that came the compromises of, you know, virtually everything that came along since.
It's a good point, David. Do you think it is necessary to tone yourself down to make it in the mainstream? By the way, the song Tutti Frutti, which David might be referring to, is very graphically explicit about anal sex. So, and they changed the lyrics, they rewrote them to go to the mainstream audience when they didn't have to in the Black audience. So I wonder if we think, what are your thoughts on, like, we have to tone it down to go to get mainstream success?
I think that's actually what all Black musicians did at the time. Is that?
Do you think they have to do it now? Do you think they have to do it now, though?
It's literally 40 years later. I mean, to a degree, I don't think so. But I think at that time, in that period, one of the successes of Motown was that Motown was playing soul music, which you would have found in a club, toned down for a mainstream audience. Little Richard toned down his music so that it was acceptable to get onto a mainstream, which would have got him paid, which would have helped him to look after his mother. The things he talks about loving in the documentary, those are quite moving, where he talks about looking after, buying a house for his family. You know, the first house he ever bought, how important that was. Those are the things that are kind of interesting. And to do that, he had to go from the chitlin circuit to the mainstream to actually do that. And to do that in 1961. You have to also understand in 1959, Liberace successfully sued the Daily Mirror, which said that he was gay, and he won.
And won,
you know,
and won.
Which is astonishing. That bizarre. That was the bizarre period that he was in, is that he could come to London in 1961 and also the UK in 1961 and 62 and inspire the Rolling Stones and David Bowie, but have to go back to the States where, you know, he had nothing. You know, he could only stay in certain hotels. He could only, you know, those were his problems.
Yes, yes, and thanks for contextualizing the time as well, both racially and sexual orientation wise. If you all have any questions, please do throw them in the chat, or any thoughts. There's a chat on the side for you to do that. We're going to show a clip now, which is about religion, how Little Richard recloseted himself after being very out, you know, being interviewed on TV, going, I'm gay, I'm gay, I'm gay. He went back into the closet, became a Christian preacher, and said, I'm not gay. And we're going to show a clip of that. Thank you.
As a kid who came from a church family, who was Black and queer and femme and disabled, who'd been bullied by not only other kids, but also his father.
There's a lot of violence that attends trying to live a queer life.
Here's the one and only Little Richard.
I guess he held himself responsible for the degradation he figured that he brought to the world, and yet what he brought us was freedom.
You ain't supposed to hide nothing. You got it. God gave it. Show it to the world. No, I don't want to hide. I love him.
He was very, very good at liberating other people through his example. He was not good at liberating himself.
Oh, that, when I saw that at first, that really hit me. Jsky, what do you think of not very good at liberating himself?
It's something we could all be quite guilty of being. I think naturally I'm the type of person, if I see someone else is in need, I want to help them. But when it comes to helping yourself, that's something that's sometimes forgotten. What I like about Little Richard is that he had this fire inside of him where he knew, well, in the early clips anyway, he wasn't afraid to just bear the sexuality, the makeup, the eccentricity, the flamboyance. He wasn't, and even sometimes you could see in the face of the people that are interviewing him the sort of confusion and disdain, but yet as much as they dislike it, they can't control it or tame it, so they just had to accept and embrace it. And I've had similar moments where, like, I can see somebody doesn't really appreciate what I'm bringing to the table, but if you can just turn the dial up a little bit, not so that you're like cocky or like arrogant, because that's not what he was. He was just unapologetically himself.
And Mark, you know, there is this idea of the closet. I kind of want to break that down, of being out and being in, and how we as Black people deal with that idea, because it's framed in a very white way. You're either out or in, and one's bad and one's good, and there's a binary. I want to kind of bring that into the discussion, because I know you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I do. You know, for many years, I kind of understood that for many of us, it's not safe to be out. You know, either because of rejection, because of the violence, because of all these things that we've mentioned before, right? But also there's stuff that we perceive might happen to us. And there's lots of stuff that we don't want to give up. We don't want to give up our church. We don't want to give up where we get our hair cut or where we get our food and all of these things. We want to be part of our community. So it is a balancing act. But I also recognize that historically, throughout our communities, we have had out queer people in our communities. Auntie so-and-so down the road that lives with Miss Mary, Mr. Jones who's always single. And it's just, we don't use particular language for it, right? We don't use this European language of coming out, being open, etc., etc. However, I do believe that as an individual, there is real power and strength when we are able to use the phrase the kids use these days, our true and authentic selves. And we're able to present in that way. And I think that what Little Richard shows us is a complexity of our lives, but also that our identities are never fluid. And where they sit with us, they're not always fluid, you know, so they're not always fixed. And I think just really quickly, I'll just wrap up, is that what surprised me in the documentary, which I didn't know, because I knew about his rejection of his sexuality and embracing of the church. What I didn't know was that it came at a time when he had an absolute emotional breakdown because of drugs and the loss of his brother. So I think all of those things was somebody going wholesale, I need to restart my life. And restarting my life means rejecting all of these things, which in my mind are bad. But there's a redemption towards the end of the documentary when he talks about love is love.
Yes, he does. And David, what do you think of that whole, the binary of in the closet, out the closet, religion, not queer, all those things?
I think for lots of performers at that period, there was what happened on tour, and then there was your real life. So if you look at the life of someone like Ray Charles or Ike Turner, all the things that actually happened on tour were things that happened on tour. They had families and a base in wherever they were living. So at the time of his Little Richard's brother's death, he was living in LA. The family was still living in, I think, Georgia, for example, where he could have all the kind of madness that goes on with being, a famous rock star, going to orgies, taking drugs and cocaine, and doing all of those things. But actually, he would then have to come home to his mother and his brother. But his brother's death, obviously, as Mark was pointing out, it's really shocking to see that this came at a period where he was obviously having a form of breakdown, and there was no support for him, and he essentially went to pray away the gay, and things up.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about praying away the gay and the church, and Little Richard was what we call a gender non-conforming person, a femme. And in African spirituality, the femmes are the shamans. And when I saw the bit about him in church, I thought, he's a shaman, he's shamanistic. He's a shamanistic person on stage. When he comes to Britain and he just catches the spirit on stage, I'm like, that's shamanistic. And then also in the church when he's preaching as well, it's like he's the same person, but it's different context. I wonder if you have thoughts on that, and yes, the breakdown, but also in a way that bit of us which has never gone away, not with transatlantic slavery, but has stayed with us. Do you have any thoughts, Mark?
I think that's kind of interesting. But if you look at the performers of the time, the performers that he was performing with, when he was performing with Sam Cooke, those were people that were charismatic on stage, that performed on stage. That came from the blues, the chitlin circuit, where performance is important. The church is important. They all came from that. They all came from performing in the church.
Yes.
You talked about Amazing Grace. That moment at Amazing Grace, at Aretha's father's church, those are moments where you're just like, you're there for the moment. She takes you there. She moves, as you might say, you're moved by the spirit. If you saw, unfortunately, I never got to see Little Richard. I'd love to have been at that concert in 1961 where, the Rolling Stones, where Mick Jagger watched, because they were on tour for a month, literally learnt his act from watching Little Richard. The thing that's also interesting about this particular part of the documentary is that there are no interviews with any of his family members. That's really significant in this documentary. None of his family members archived. There was nothing. That's interesting.
Yes, thanks for that point. Thanks for that point, David. I don't know if, to David's point, Mark, have you got anything to add about, even the spirituality, the move by the spirit, and the lack of family members in the entire documentary, although we reveal lots of things.
I hadn't noticed a bit about the family members, and that is a really interesting point. I think, in terms of the spirituality and the performance, again, it is something which is just so present in Black performance,
Yes.
And I think you can very often tell the performers that have come from church and those that haven't.
Yes.
I think very often of Luther Vandross, and Luther Vandross was not a church singer, right? And so that's very kind of controlled. But I also think it was quite interesting because I've seen the Amazing Grace documentary and I am moved by it, but I'm not shaken because Aretha's quite relatively restrained compared to Richard. And there's a wildness to Little Richard, which I think is absolutely incredible, and fire. There is fire in him.
Yes, there is fire in him. There's also fire in James Cleveland, because when I saw him conducting, I was like, family, just the way he moved. No, seriously. And then I was told he was. So thank you very, very much. There are some questions from the audience right now. So to everybody here, Wendy's asking, how do you all contend with the disparity between Richard's renouncement of homosexuality and his influence on Black music and culture? Do you want to say something, Jsky?
There's definitely a lot to unpack with that one.
I
think everyone's relationship with how they choose to define themselves should remain their own. It's hard to judge, and judging doesn't help either. But in terms of how I revere this man, I revere him as someone that was, in his early days, quite fearless, and he opened a lot of doors. And at the end of the story, he goes back to, in his opinion, he's saving people. He's helping to cure them. He's helping to elevate their religious experience. So he's still using his gifts. And it's just interesting because I think when people are oppressed in life, and when they are an artist and they get the chance to be on stage to do their thing, it is liberating. And that's why they get that power to be able to help liberate others in such a grand way. And I think because of the pressures and the constraints he had on himself, a lot of them might have been in his mind, a lot of them might have been real from his family and his circumstance, but because of the constraints that were upon him, when he was given the opportunity to be on stage and be free, there's just no taming him.
Yes, there wasn't. He literally caught the spirit on stage. If you all know that term, to catch the spirit. Mark, do you have anything to add to that?
I think if I'm reading Wendy's question correctly, and forgive me if I'm not, and I hope that I am, there's his rejection of his homosexuality and turning his back on that outweigh his contribution to black music,
black culture.
And I think the way that I look at that is that what Little Richard did was an individual choice for him. I don't think he damaged the cause of homosexuality. I think that there was enough homophobia going on in the system, in the world, which Little Richard may have added a little pinch to. I think that his influence on not just black culture, but on culture, period. As we see at that flash clip at the end of all of the artists that he has influenced, okay, that for me is what's the word? Immeasurable.
Absolutely. And Prince always name-checked him. One of the greatest artists of the 20th century, Prince, always name-checked Little Richard as his influence. David, any thoughts?
I think
Before we go to the next question.
I agree with Mark. I think it was an individual choice. I don't personally. I mean, I think Praying Away the Gay is one way to go. I think as a performer on stage, all of those things he did were amazing. I think what he says about black culture, what it says about black queer culture, all of those things are fantastic. Him as a musician, as a performance, I wish I'd seen him. I've only to be able to have seen him on clips that are either in other documentaries or on YouTube. But from what all he says is that, from all it says and all it said in the documentary, is the amount of people that he influenced, his effect on the culture, is immeasurable. He was an icon. He was an icon before people use the term icon a lot now. A legend, an icon. He was all those things. He was beyond. He was one of those people that was beyond idiom. He was beyond. There are various characters you can say. You know, like there's a Miles Davis. There's a James Brown. All of those little people. Those people. A Pele. People who you can just say, well, you know, Little Richard, and you know where you are. You know exactly where you are, what you're listening to. And people don't seem to understand the kind of revolutionary nature of, you know, the original lyrics to Tutti Frutti, a song which people found, you know, anal sex. You know,
absolutely
that's remarkable.
Going back to the Chitlin circuit, it wasn't banned there. Rosemary has a question. I'd like you to answer that, David. How do you think Little Richard would have survived today's cancel culture?
I don't actually think cancel. I've no idea. I think, if you like, his Praying Away the Gay was his, which he did a couple of times in his career. When in the documentary, when you see that he went over to Australia and, you know, had a breakdown, when his brother died, he had a further breakdown. You know, those were those moments where he went back home, got back better, and then came back to perform. You know, our understanding of him as a person is him as a performer. It isn't Richard. It isn't Richard Pembleton. We only understand Little Richard as that one we never get to meet. You know, I don't know. Did he meet James Baldwin? Did he have conversations with Martin Luther King? If I was around that period, I wish I would have done, but I don't think he did. You know.
Yeah. What do you think, Mark? Do you think he would have got?
Did he hang about with Langston Hughes? You know, what was it like? You know, when
I
Langston
somehow
Hughes
doubt that.
Yeah, absolutely. I know they didn't, but that would have been an amazing moment.
It would have been, but it'd be like the club kids and the academic. I don't know. I'm making assumptions here. But Mark, do you think he would have been cancelled?
I think he would have put out a tweet going, "Girl, please." I think that's what he would have done. I think he'd be like, "Honey, cancel all you want. I'm coming back." I mean, and I think that's the thing, though, right? Is that if he did denounce his sexuality today, say if we take little Nas X, all of a sudden found God, yes, he would be cancelled immediately without the opportunity, and that's why I kind of don't even buy. I think, you know, David, you know, ruffled a little bit when we hear cancel culture, and I just think he would have just said, "Go, please."
Yeah, I feel the same. I don't know about you, Sky.
Yeah, I don't think he would have survived it. I think he would have done something that people would have rebelled against, especially the whole "I'm not gay anymore" situation. I think people would have wrote him off. And that's a shame, really, because I think
a lot of people did write him off, though.
No, but I think in terms of his legacy, I think that might have suffered a lot more damage. And I think, like, when people go in and out of the closet in such a public way, I think they're actually victims of their own homophobia. And it's not a case of, because I think with his journey, he's not really doing anything particularly damaging. He's not like protesting against gay people or anything like that. He's just trying to save people from his perspective. So I think in many ways, as much as people might feel like he let the side down, I think if anything, society let him down.
It sure did. Were you itching to say something, Mark?
No.
Oh, okay. Tanya's got a question again. When listening, I was struck by the similarity of a what Babalupa pull up bam boom line in Tutti Frutti. I hope I did that okay, Tanya. And we got together from Greece. How do you read Little Richard's influence on this prolific musical? So on Greece. We seem to have lost David, but I think he'll come back in a minute. So do you think he had an influence
on Greece?
Yeah, Greece. Greece.
Well, Greece is a 1950s rock and roll movie about high school kids who would have been into rock and roll, right?
Yeah.
But probably would have been in a segregated audience that Little Richard was playing that. And that's probably not reflected that honestly in Greece. But I mean, I think, if you listen to the Grease soundtrack, it clearly is a tribute to rock and roll of the period, but black artists within the film and within the music are not acknowledged. It's completely whitewashed. It's completely white bread. I love Grease, for the record, but it is what it is. It's not black Grease. It's not hair grease.
Oh my God. I want to see that movie though. Hair grease.
Let's talk.
Let's talk. My mate. Jay Sky. Oh, I was just laughing. Jay Sky, what do you think about like Grease? I guess it is rock and roll that erased the blackness in a way. The Grease movie, but have you seen Grease, Jason?
Oh yeah, of course, I've seen Grease.
Yeah. So what do you think? Do you think they stole?
It's hard when you're an artist and you get inspired by someone and you want to take a bit of creativity, or if you're a real big fan of someone, not to want to do something in a similar vein. I think the real issue comes from when someone else is not given an equal playing field. Like, I know you've touched on the whole concept of whitewashing a few times on this conversation. Like, for me personally, if someone wants to cover one of my songs, I'm flattered more than anything, but like, as long as people know where the origination came from. And I think that's what's missing often, that people believe that someone else is the source, as you said. And it's just a shame that he had to be exploited in a way where he wasn't making money for it. Grease, great film, but I mean, obviously, if there was to redo it now, it'd be called a woke version of Grease because there'd be a multicultural cast in there.
You can watch Pink Ladies on Disney Plus, which is very multicultural.
There we go.
Yes, exactly. Amelia has a great question, and I'm sure you'll have like fantastic answers. What are some of the contemporary black queer artists that we should check out now?
Jay Sky.
Jay Sky, one. Where can we get your music, Jay Sky? Everywhere.
Okay. Jay Sky into Google. You can stream it, Spotify, YouTube, you name it.
Okay, because you got to say, Tyler the Creator said, "Big up yourself." Who's also a black queer artist? Mark.
I mean, right now I'm really into the Gabriels, which are an amazing band with a black queer lead in there as well. Obviously, we've got Little Nas X, who
got MNEK.
MNEK here, great producer. So who's behind the boards creating music, and and I think that's I think as well, what's really important is where we are, not just the artist, but who's in the back room, right? Who's pulling the strings? Who's making sure that other artists are influencers? So Flow, a girl group, are going to be one of the biggest bands in this country in the next couple of years. Black queer person behind the boards.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So that for me is, again, Little Richard's DNA is in MNEK.
Yes.
And these are the things that I want people today to recognize. Go back to that source. When you watch a documentary, go and listen to Little Richard Essentials on whatever platform you listen to, and then go look for the black queer artists that come through.
I think there's also Janelle Monáe, somebody shouted out. Shout out to Janelle Monáe. There's Nakane from South Africa, who's amazing. Check their music out. There's Serpents or Without Feet.
Yeah,
Check their
Serpent
music out as well. Old school Joan Armour Trading, British person. Check her music out. Guess what? No, the other people, there's some other. I've got a whole list. So I'll come back to you on that. David hasn't joined us. I think we've lost his feed at the moment. So, David, you're back. David, you would just want to give a quick shout out to any Black queer artists you know? That was a question from Emilio. Oh, David's gone again. Okay, I'm so sorry about that. We've got to, I'm getting the wrap up signals. And so I want to thank the BFI, who's our main sponsor, and who've continued to support Peccadillo Sofa Club. This is our second season. We'll be back for a few specials over the summer, including a look at the short film Sam, and also an interview with some of the crew behind the hit Netflix series Heartstopper, so look out for that. But it will leave you tonight with a trailer from our back catalogue for I Am Divine. And we all know who Divine is, right? So revolutionary, flamboyant drag performer. Let's roll the clip, please. Thank you. Goodbye and good night. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Jsky. And thank you, David, for the amazing conversation. Enjoy the clip and enjoy the movie. And thanks for the wonderful questions.
People like to laugh at sex, people like to laugh at dirty things, and people love to be shocked, I think. You make my nips get hard. So that's my job, to get out there and shock them.
Divine was dangerous. Part outlaw, part serial killer.
She was simultaneously sexy and monstrous. Is she gonna screw me or eat me?
The pediatrician told me that Glennie was more feminine, was masculine.
He got beat up every day at school. When Divine finally did go out, he met gay people, and then he went out with a vengeance. Divine was breaking the rules of drag.
John Waters started to make films for our own enjoyment and to keep us out of trouble.
And that's how Divine got born. Immediately, everybody noticed him.
Anything that John asked Divvy to do, he would do.
Divine ate a dog turd, and I don't think anybody in the history of cinema is ever going to top that feat.
John and Divine became a phenomenon.
If they had any kind of name, he wanted to meet him. And guess what? He did.
He was very depressed because he was trying to parlay this Divine character into an acting career as a man.
Before, it was just always this fat transvestite with a big candy floss wig. They couldn't see beyond the paint and the exterior.
He really wanted to be known as a character actor. It was really important to him.
He was such a gregarious, pink piece of flesh. We just figured he'd go on forever.
No one else can ever call themselves divine. That's her legacy.
He stood for anybody that didn't fit in, that exaggerated what everybody hated, turned it into a style, and won.
I am divine.